On the evening of the 25th of June, 1728, the Mary Russell sailed into her home port in Cove in Cork Harbor. The pilot came out to meet her. He found an unbelievable scene. Most of the crew had been brutally murdered, and her captain was missing. I'm Mick Biddick, and this is History is Criminal. In this episode, we take a look at the incredible and true story of the Mary Russell, a story of murder and madness on the high seas. The Mary Russell had set sail from Cove Cork Harbor on the 7th of February in 1828, headed for Barbados carrying a cargo of mules. Cove, for short, was a relatively small but important port on the southern coast of Ireland. Captain William Stewart had an outstanding reputation. The owners of ships appreciated him for his reliability and honesty. He had a strong standing among sailors for his fairness. In the 1700s, a ship's captain had near godlike powers. Their words were law, and their orders were to be followed without question, even if those orders seemed odd or unnecessary. Sailors had no right to resist their captains. Discipline was harsh. Flogging with the cat o' nine tails was common. Captain Stewart, however, preferred to tie as opposed to flogging, adding to his reputation as a kind and good master. Tying was just what it sounds like. The offending sailor would be tied up until the captain felt they'd learned their lesson, and then they were released and could return to work. Between work being slow and Stewart's outstanding reputation as a good and fair captain, it was easy for him to find a fine crew for the voyage to Barbados. His first and second mates, William Smith and William Swanson, were experienced sailors who had sailed with Stewart before. John Kramer, the ship's carpenter, would be of the utmost importance on a wooden ship making a transatlantic crossing. The crew also consisted of three seamen, John Howes, Francis Sullivan, and John Keating. Of the three, Howes was the most experienced. He had served as first mate on other vessels. He was also a large and powerful built man who struck an imposing figure. Three apprentices were also among the crew: John Davies, 15, Daniel Scully, 13, and Henry Richards, 13. For a boy in Cove, this was a great opportunity. After a transatlantic voyage, they might be able, on their return, to sign on as a mate on a later voyage and make a good living. Two ostlers, or stablemen, were on board to tend for the mules: Timothy Connell and James Morley. Morley spoke primarily Irish, with only poor and broken English. This was going to make a comeback later in the story. One passenger also traveled aboard the Mary Russell. Thomas Hammond, 11, was a sick child and a close family friend of Captain Stewart. Only a year older than Stewart's own son, he had known the captain his whole life and viewed him as almost like a loving uncle. It was thought that a trip to the West Indies would do his health some good. As Stewart was a trusted family friend, the Hammonds must have thought they had nothing to worry about in sending their child aboard a long voyage. Young Thomas would spend most of the journey, both to and from Barbados, in his bunk in the main cabin. This would make him a key witness to the events that occurred on the Mary Russell. The Mary Russell was a brig, about 80 feet long, a little small for the crossing, but she was a fairly new ship. Her size would allow for a smaller crew, but also would mean a tight space for the 13 crewmen and passenger. Before leaving port, the chief mate, Swanson, and Captain Stewart had some kind of falling out, the details of which I could not find on the record. However, when this happened, Smith was promoted to chief mate and Swanson was demoted to second mate. This didn't seem to cause much of an issue among the crew, maybe because of Stewart's outstanding reputation as being a reasonable captain. The trip to Barbados was smooth sailing. Sorry, couldn't resist that. There was only one report of punishment on the outward journey. The senior apprentice, Davies, was beaten for cursing the ship. From what I could gather, cursing the ships means literally to have said something negative about the ship, thus inviting trouble for the journey. Sailors were known to be a little superstitious. And while this beating might sound harsh AF, it seems the beating was more like the type administered by a typical school teacher of the 1700s. Not as if that's necessarily a great thing, but nearly not as bad as some captains were dishing out to their crew. The rest of the journey to Barbados went off routinely. The captain was that. It is important to note here that only the captain would possess all the needed tools and skills to navigate the ship across the open ocean. Teaching a mate to navigate was not only frowned upon, but in the British Navy it was actually illegal. A mate who independently kept track of the course and speed could be punished with even potentially the death penalty for this offense. The idea had its logical reasoning. If only the captain could navigate across the open ocean, then the likelihood of a mutiny was greatly reduced. Now, this makes perfect sense. If you took over the ship and killed the captain, you'd be sitting there in the middle of the ocean looking at each other going, anybody know how to drive this thing? And while it seems a little odd at this point, the captain actually began to give John Howes, who showed an interest in celestial navigation, the captain began to act as his tutor. The captain even made the rare occasion of inviting Howes to share a glass of grog with him after Howes had made a successful observation. On arriving in Barbados, the Mary Russell would be rafted to the Mary Stubbs. Don't know why all the ships had Mary in the first name, but they did. Rafting was the habit of tying ships together in port. This added stability, saved space in the harbor, and allowed crews to easily socialize with one another. The Mary Stubbs was captained by Robert Callender. The two captains shared a great deal in common and spent much time talking to one another in the evenings. The Mary Russell stayed in Barbados longer than planned. Part of the captain's job was to make sure they sold the mules at the best price possible, and then, working with the ship's agent, find a profitable cargo for the return trip home. As for the crew, they would have to unload the cargo, in this case the mules, make any needed repairs, a transatlantic crossing could be rough on an old wooden ship, and load the new cargo. That schedule would leave some downtime. It was during this downtime that Smith would incur the wrath of the captain. Though not a beating or tying, just a good old-fashioned butt chewing. When he stayed on shore overnight, according to Smith, quote, while in Barbados, I slept out one night. The captain was angry for it and said I was a pretty pattern for the men. Now, this seems to fly in the face of the stereotype of sailors hitting port and going out on a drunken rampage. That didn't happen on Stewart's watch. It might also have been that Smith had hit up a brothel while a married man, and Stewart would have seen that as a poor example for the young apprentices on board. The long stay in port would have been an unattended blessing for the young Thomas Hammonds. The extra time in the warm Barbados climate would have been just what he had traveled for. It also allowed the captain to pick up a valuable cargo. Using the profits from the sale of the mules, he was able to fill the ship's hold with barrels of sugar and hides, in addition to other valuables from the islands. The Mary Russell also picked up one other item, a passenger. Captain James Gould Rains was also from Cove and Cork. He had been removed to the captain of his own ship, the Iberia, for drunkenness. Upon learning that the Mary Russell was returning to Cove, he begged for a lift. At first, Captain Stewart rejected him, most likely knowing Rains' reputation as a drunkard. Stewart would not want a man like that on his ship where he could be a bad influence on his crew. But Stewart, being known for having a kind heart, eventually took pity on the man and gave passage to Rains. The Mary Russell left Barbados on a return voyage for Cove on the 9th of May, 1828. The crossing would normally take approximately 40 days and follow a different northerly route, but a predictable course on the way home. The Mary Stubbs was not scheduled to leave for the next day and would follow a similar route. However, it would seem unlikely the two ships would cross paths again. The voyage home started off smooth. On about the 10th day of the return trip, however, the captain had a disturbing dream. He told Smith about it. In the dream, Rains had enticed the crew to mutiny, and Stewart was believing the dream to be more a prophetic warning than anything. The captain had become convinced that Rains had feared returning home to the embarrassment of having lost his command. For Smith's part, he tried to convince the captain that it was only a dream and there was nothing to worry about. Smith told Stewart that the crew was loyal to him and that he had heard nothing to the contrary. Smith then, maybe feeling a little closer to the captain, confided his own dark secret. Smith told the captain that while serving in the British Navy, he had taken part in the murder of a Royal Marine. Why Smith chose this time to confess to his captain is unclear, but the result, Stewart lost trust in Smith and had his bunk exchanged with Swanson, moving Smith out of the main cabin. It was reported that Rains got along well with the crew. He worked alongside the crew as a way to pay for his passage. Joking and telling stories to one another was a way to pass time on a long sea voyage. Rains would even converse with the men in Irish, a language that Stewart didn't understand. This added to Stewart's growing distrust of Rains and the effect he was having on the crew. He would eventually order Rains to stop speaking Irish to the crew. The captain had now become convinced there was a growing plot to remove him. He was sure the crew was going to kill him and felt he could only trust the younger sailors and apprentices. He ordered Frank Sullivan, Timothy Connell, to sleep outside his door and watch for trouble. Then he armed himself with a harpoon, a carpenter's axe, and a pitchfork-type tool called a grannis, and a crowbar. He now began to suffer from insomnia as his paranoia grew worse each day. At this point, the captain now refused to teach Howes any navigation. Later, when mate Keating asked Stewart if he knew whether or not Rains was a good navigator, it sealed the deal. He was now sure the crew was going to kill him and replace him with Rains. Stewart called all hands on deck and confronted the crew with his suspicions. He used Howe's interest in navigation and Keating's question as proof that mutiny was coming. When the crew responded with shock and swore their loyalty to Stewart, it seemed to relieve his concerns. The relief, however, was only temporary. Shortly after this, he called Chief Mate Smith, Rains, and the apprentice Davies to his captain. He yelled about how Rains spoke Irish to the crew, claiming it to be proof of a conspiracy. He ordered most of the charts and navigational tools to be thrown out a window, which was done without question. He reportedly told the men, "They are my own, and I can make more." He tore up and tossed out pages from the logbook. In Stewart's mind, this would have made mutiny a near suicidal move. Later, the captain would confess to investigator William Scoresby that he had kept a secret stash of charts and tools. Thomas Hammond had witnessed all this from his sickbed in the main cabin. Thomas Hammond had known the captain his whole life, but he didn't recognize the man he was seeing. Stewart was nervous and pale. He never took off his clothes to sleep, and when in bed, he barely slept. Hammond also stated that the captain had a frightening look in his eye that he had never seen before. Stewart seemed to be going mad before his very eyes. Others noticed that the captain, when he spoke, jumped from one subject to another without reason and gave bizarre excuses for his behavior. On approximately the 16th or 17th of June, they came across another ship, the Mary Harriet. Again, another ship that's first part of its name is Mary. I don't know why. Maybe it has something to do with the Virgin Mary. Maybe it has something to do with Queen Mary. I don't know. The Mary Harriet came alongside, and Stewart, with 3 others, went aboard. It is assumed that Stewart told the captain of the Mary Harriet about his fears of mutiny because the captain gave him a brace of pistols, a brace being a fancy old word for a pair. Stewart hid these pistols from the crew. He also came back with extra provisions. The night of the 18th and 19th of June, Smith was on watch, but the oil lamp kept running out. This caused Smith to have to go to the locker to fetch oil an unusual amount of times during the night. Captain Stewart, suffering from insomnia, heard Smith's multiple trips to the locker. Stewart became convinced that Smith was looking for some type of weapon to use against him. Yet somehow the captain did eventually manage to fall asleep. However, when he woke up the next morning, he armed himself with a harpoon and headed to the half deck where Smith was now bunking. Finding Smith in his bunk, Stewart told him he was lucky he was there. Had he found him anywhere else, he would have killed him. Smith was surprised and confused. He thought the captain was his friend, and now he had a harpoon pointed at him. Stewart accused Smith of being the ringleader of a coming mutiny. The commotion had drawn the attention of the rest of the crew. Stewart questioned, "Is it not true Smith is the leader?" as he poked the harpoon at Smith's chest. "Smith is the leader of the mutiny, is he not?" The crew attempted to reassure and calm the captain, but Stewart was convinced. "Tell me the truth. I am convinced that my suspicions are correct. There is a mutinous plot afoot aboard this ship. Every last man is involved." The crew swore their innocence and spoke to the captain individually to try and assure him that no plot and that Smith was loyal. Howes told the captain, "We wouldn't harm a hair on your head, Captain Stewart. This is the God's honest truth." This seemed to calm the captain, and he dropped the harpoon. He told the crew through tears they were all honest men, and in a sudden mood swing, he ordered that Smith now be tied up. Smith refused to comply, stating he had done nothing wrong. The crew seemed unsure what to do at first, but it was the order of the captain, and it would be followed. They told Smith that it would be best just to allow himself to be tied up, and this would be the best way to get things back to normal and calm the captain down. They also said they could make things right once they returned to Cove, most likely meaning if Smith had been wrongfully disciplined, the situation could be rectified by some legal means when they got back on land. Smith complied and was tied and placed in a hold in the foot of the main cabin. When Smith later complained that he couldn't get enough air, Stewart had the ship's carpenter put air holes in the hold. Then they shut him up again in the cramped hold. Ordered that the rigging of the ship be changed to a different and unusual configuration. This new rigging would slow the ship to make it easier for the ship to be crewed by a smaller crew, or potentially just one man. The ship's crew wondered about the wisdom of this order, but carried it out anyway. Remember, the captain was to be followed without question. Stewart had come to the conclusion that he had to tie up all 9 of the crew members, leaving only himself and the apprentices to man the ship. The only problem was, how would Stewart, a relatively small man, take down the whole crew? He called the 3 apprentices to his cabin, John Davies, Daniel Scully, and Henry Richards. He told the boys that a mutiny was afoot and they had to help him. Between threatening the boys with his pistols and telling them that they would be heroes, he was able to get their help. He swore them into secrecy on punishment of death, and then forced them to sign a paper stating that there was a mutiny taking place and it had to be put down. At intervals of 15 to 20 minutes, he called each member of the crew to his cabin and charged them with mutiny and had the boys tie them. The first was Timothy Connell. Once tied, he was moved to the interior cabin out of sight. As tying was the captain's standard form of punishment, the crew seemed to protest little. Thomas Hammond sat in his bunk and watched as each crew member was tied. It went fairly seamlessly until the last sailor. Howes would later state that he thought the captain had called them in one at a time to possibly apologize to them individually for his actions. There might even be a pint of grog or rum waiting for him. Maybe this thought had Howes' mind wandering because he stumbled on his way into the cabin. When he stumbled down a few steps, the captain shouted, "Do not come down so fast." It was at this time that Howes saw the pistol in Stewart's hand. Howes questioned the captain about the pistol, and the captain's only response was that he had heard all. The captain's implication was that the others had confessed, which they hadn't. Howes insisted he didn't know anything about a mutiny and started back up the stairs. The captain pulled the trigger on the pistol, but they both misfired. As Howes yelled back, "Remember, you snapped 2 pistols at me, and I'll have satisfaction when we get to Cork if it costs me my life." Chasing after Howes with the pistols in his hands, the captain yelled back, "I'll satisfy you. I'll give you satisfaction." While recharging the pistols, he fired once more, missing Howes. Howes made it to a hatch and ducked inside. There, he ran into Morley, the Irish-speaking mule handler. He pushed Morley back into the shadows below deck. The captain knew better than to pursue 2 men in the dark confines of the belly of the ship. He also knew he couldn't overpower Howes, but maybe he could talk the larger man into surrendering. Shouting to Howes, Stewart said he was justified in shooting anyone who refused to obey. He also told Howes he would tell the authorities that Howes was the ringleader of the mutiny. The captain even went as far as to tell him that he had not slept for days, and that if Howes allowed him to be tied, the captain could finally fall asleep. Once rested, he would be feeling himself again and would release them all with no harm done. Maybe it was the years of following captains unquestionably. Maybe he felt genuine empathy for Stewart. No matter the reason, it worked. Howes came forward and allowed himself to be tied. Morley submitted without a fight. Now the entire crew, save the apprentices and Hammond, were tied. The captain armed the boys and had them keep watch. After a few days, and moving all the captives into the same location, the captain spoke to the men. At this point, they were about 300 miles from Ireland. The captain offered the crew the longboat and provisions. The crew seemed to go for the idea, except Smith, knowing that being put in a longboat and set adrift would basically amount to an admission of guilt. Also knowing that mutineers were hung, Smith refused to be set out in the longboat. It was also pointed out that the captain and the boys wouldn't be able to lower the boat by themselves. The captain would have to release at least 3 able-bodied men to lower the boat. Stewart wouldn't agree to do that. It was clear to the captain that unless they passed another ship, his only hope was to keep the crew tied up. If they came across another vessel, the crew could be transferred and Stewart could finish the journey home. In the meantime, Howes had worked his bondage loose. When Stewart came to check on him, he noticed the loose ropes and then used the gun to threaten Howes, demanding that he allow himself to be retied. Howes refused, saying he'd rather be shot than be tied again. Howes called the captain a barbarian. "You're worse than a Turk or Tartar." This insult pushed the captain further over the edge. Apparently, comparing him to a person from the Middle East was a step too far. Interesting line to draw here. The captain then fired one pistol and missed. Firing the second pistol, he hit Howes in the hand. Recharging the pistol, he fired a third time, grazing Howes' side. Howes used the blood to fake a more severe injury, yelling, "You've shot me through the guts. I'm not long for this world." The captain, now convinced Howes was dead, turned to the boys and told them to keep an eye on the hatch. They would report if they saw Howes move. The boys reported that he was quite dead. He told the boys that because of the blood, they would soon have to throw Howes overboard. It was at this point that they spotted a ship on the horizon. He ordered Scully to hoist the distress signal. The ship closed the distance, coming close enough for Stewart to yell out to them. For some unknown reason, though, the ship then turned and sailed away, and with it went any chance of rescue. Stewart returned to Howes, who now sat up. Stewart then fired again, hitting Howes in the thigh. The captain called for the boys, now armed with the harpoon, the crowbar, and the axe. Howes told the boys he was an innocent man and that they shouldn't let the captain lead them down this path. The boys were in tears. The captain yelled at the boys to push the attack or he would blow their brains out. Howes was able to get his hands on the captain Stewart was little match, even for a wounded Howes. The captain dropped his pistols, and Howes pinned him to the deck. Then he ripped the harpoon from Davy's hand. Howes admitted later that he hesitated, worried that if he killed the captain, he would indeed be charged with mutiny when they returned to land. That was enough of a break. It allowed Richards to attack, striking Howes in the head with the axe. Howes would survive this, but it allowed the captain and the boys to escape. Howes then hid in the cargo hold. Now the captain had come to the conclusion that his only possible solution was to kill the remaining crew. He told the men they needed to pray that the ship come by and rescue them. He told Richards that he was going to be given a reward, 100 guineas, for saving the ship, and be a gentleman for the rest of all your life. Thomas Hammond saw Richards with the bloody axe and assumed Howes was dead. He pulled the blanket over his head so that Richards would not see him crying. Then a ship came into view. Again the distress signal was raised and the ship came close, closing the gap between themselves and the Mary Russell. The ship approached, noticed that the only people visible were the captain and 3 boys. They became concerned that the ship might be under the control of pirates, attempting to lure them to their doom. So the ship then turned and sailed off, leaving the Mary Russell by herself. Sometime in the early evening of the 22nd of June, the captain decided that he should carry out the sentence for mutiny. He ordered the boys to bring all the captives, except Smith, who was still in the hold, to the main cabin. He had the men lashed to the deck. It was done in a way that if they did anything other than lie face down, they would choke. The captain reasoned that if God wanted them to live, one of the ships they had passed would have rescued them. He saw this as divine proof of their guilt. He started with second mate, William Swanson. He smashed the crowbar down on his head. He went from man to man, bringing the crowbar down on each with great force. Thomas Hammond followed the captain, begging him to spare the men, or at least sail the ship home. Stewart ignored his pleas. The last was Rains. The captain said, "James, I put a heavy curse on you, but now I take it off." With that, he brought the crowbar down on his head. When he finished with the crowbar, some of the victims still moaned, most likely dying. He then took the axe and again struck each of his victims. Blood had splattered across the main cabin. Hammond, who had witnessed the whole gruesome happenings from his bed, was covered in blood. Then Stewart remembered Smith in the hold. Grabbing the harpoon, he stabbed it through the air holes. Smith was hit several times. He lost part of an ear and one eye. Then the captain took the axe and busted open the hatch. Once again, taking the harpoon, he stabbed at Smith. While bloodied and still, Stewart assumed Smith was dead. But by a small miracle, Smith was still alive. The captain left Smith for dead, and he was able to slip into the cargo hold. Stewart then sat in the main cabin and ate. With the ship's wheel tied, the captain and the boys with him, he told them they would each be rewarded for their part in saving the ship. He told Richards he would get £2,000 for saving the captain, and he himself would be rewarded maybe £7,000 or £8,000 from Lloyd's, the insurance company, for preventing a mutiny. Stewart was finally able to get some sleep, even though his sleep was fitful. The next morning, he saw that his watch had been messed with. His paranoia now turned to the apprentices. They would need to be tied up. Stewart called the boys to the cabin and ordered them to put down their weapons. The boys complied, but when he ordered they put out their hands to be tied, they all stepped back. Hammond pleaded that the captain leave the boys alone. Stewart then swore an oath on the Bible that he would not harm the boys. The captain handed the loaded pistol to Hammond and began to tie the boys. Before he could finish with the last one, they heard a voice call to the ship. The Mary Stubbs, which had left Barbados the day after the Mary Russell, had caught up with the brig. Seeing the distress signal flying, they had come to give aid. Stewart became excited, believing his salvation had at last arrived. When Captain Callender of the Mary Stubbs came on board Stewart told him there had been a mutiny, and he had killed 8 of the mutineers. He also told him that one was still at large in the ship. Stewart showed Callender the dead crewmen and even boasted how he was able to kill them all. Callender, for his part, was silent. Then they set about hunting Howes, who Stewart believed might still be alive. When they found not only Howes, but also Smith, Stewart proclaimed that Smith must be innocent because God had spared him. Both Smith and Howes protested their innocence, but Callender took them off the Mary Russell. He would later say he had done this for their own safety. 3 crewmen from the Mary Stubbs agreed to take the Mary Russell the rest of the way to Cove. But soon the odd behavior of Stewart caused them to ask if he could be removed to the Mary Stubbs. Even at this point, Stewart's paranoia was controlling him. As they neared the coast, they passed a ship, and Stewart jumped overboard attempting to swim to the nearby 3rd vessel. However, the ship sailed away too quick. A longboat was lowered and retrieved Stewart. Later, a small fishing boat drew near. Stewart again jumped overboard, but this time made it to the small ship. Before Callender could explain the situation, the fishing vessel sailed off. Callender chose not to pursue them, but instead made for port. Once in port, William Scoresby, who just happened to be in Cove of Cork on his honeymoon, was brought to the ship. Scoresby was a former explorer and sailor of some fame, and a trained scientific observer. He would take detailed notes and even be allowed to interview the survivors and Stewart. This would make up a chapter in his book, Memorials of the Sea, published in 1830. An inquest was quickly called, and the jury of inquest was allowed to visit the crime scene before the bodies had been removed. The floor and the walls of the small cabin were covered in blood and brains. Howes and Smith even spoke to the jury before being treated for their wounds. Smith's one eye still hung from its socket. The inquest quickly concluded that Stewart had murdered the crew in a fit of madness. News reached Cove that Smith was being held in another port town not far away, and a trial date was set. At trial, the prosecution called Thomas Hammond. His testimony lasted for 4 hours. He gave details of everything he had witnessed from his bed in the main cabin. Smith and Howes were also called to testify for the prosecution. The defense did not deny that Stewart had carried out the killings, but claimed that Stewart was not in his right mind when he did it. They called several doctors to testify to Stewart's mental state. Also called were a handful of men who had sailed with Stewart in the past. Each reported that Stewart seemed to be a fine captain and a good man, but at times he would become erratic. Stewart even confided in some that his mind slipped at times, and that warm weather seemed to make it worse. At that time in England, if a person were insane, they could not be found guilty. The reasoning was that if God had caused them to lose their mental faculties, then men could not judge them. While this bizarre combination of religion and psychology as a defense might strike our modern minds as a little odd, it was 1700s English insanity defense. When the jury returned, they presented a verdict of guilty, but we believe him to be in an insane state of mind at the time. The judge informed them that we cannot receive such a verdict. Go back and rectify it. It was explained to the jury that if insane, he cannot be guilty, because the court cannot recognize the guilt of a person who did not know right from wrong at the time of their crime. Now, considering they had been burning witches just a short time before this, it seems very progressive that in the early 1700s that you could actually have an insanity defense. The jury quickly returned a second time with a verdict of not guilty, because we believe the prisoner was laboring under mental derangement when he committed the act. The boys had been held for their part in the murders were released without charges. Stewart was ordered to be held in the hospital for the insane until such time as the Crown should see fit to release him. He would die in an asylum for the criminally insane in 1873 at the age of 98. Great big shout out to the sources used here. The Ship of Seven Murders by Elena Hopkins and Catherine Bunny. William Scoresby's Memorials of the Sea, and Forced from This World, A Massacre in the Mary Russell for IrelandHistory.com. This has been History is Criminal. Join us in 2 weeks as we take a look into the story of Burke and Hare and a tale of grave robbing and murder in Victorian England.